All right, let's dive into this fascinating report we have. It's from the Rand Corporation, and it's all about managing escalation in the 21st century.
Yeah, they're a nonprofit research organization. So,
They have a reputation for being pretty thorough.
oh, absolutely, yeah.
Yeah.
Their work, it carries a lot of weight, especially when it comes to policy and stuff.
So, in this deep dive, we're going to unpack some of the key findings from this report. Specifically, we're going to focus on how understanding escalation can actually help people, make better decisions.
And not just in, like, military situations, right? This applies to all sorts of things like high-stakes negotiations, international relations, even personal conflicts.
Yeah.
Yeah,
For sure. The report really drives home the point that escalation, well, it's not just some theoretical concept. I mean, it happens all the time in different situations.
part of human nature, I think, especially when you've got competition involved.
Right. And it's like the more important the issue is, the higher the stakes.
Exactly, yeah. And the report, well, it kicks things off by defining what escalation actually is.
It's not just about things getting a bit heated.
No, it's about crossing certain lines, these thresholds, where the intensity or the scope of the conflict, it jumps to a whole new level.
So those are the moments where things could really spiral out of control.
You need to know how to manage those situations, or even better, avoid them completely.
And the report points out how escalation, it's kind of ingrained in us, especially when we're in a competitive situation.
And when you throw military force into the mix, forget about it.
I think they used a good analogy in the report. It's like a snowball rolling downhill.
Yeah, starts small, but picks up speed and size as it goes.
Becomes harder and harder to stop.
Exactly. And that's why it's so important to spot those early warning signs, those little things that might tell you things are about to escalate,
So you can, either prevent that snowball from forming in the first place.
or at least try to steer it in a direction where it won't cause too much damage.
Exactly. Now, something the report really emphasizes is how much the world has changed since the Cold War.
Back then, it was all about, potential conflict with the Soviet Union.
It was like that was the only escalation scenario anyone worried about.
But now we've got a multipolar world with nuclear-armed regional powers, non-state actors, cyber warfare, all these complex threats.
So the old playbook for managing escalation, well, it just doesn't cut it anymore.
We need new strategies, new ways of thinking about this problem.
And the report breaks down how conflicts escalate into three main categories.
Deliberate, inadvertent, and accidental.
Okay, let's start with deliberate escalation, because that seems like the most, I guess, the most straightforward.
Yeah, it's where one side intentionally raises the stakes to try and achieve a goal.
Almost like a power move.
It can be, yeah.
Mm.
But there's a lot of psychology involved, too. Deliberate escalation can be purely instrumental, directly aimed at achieving a specific military or political objective. But it can also be used suggestively as a way to send a message, like a warning or a punishment.
It's a bit like playing poker, right? Raising the bet to see how your opponent reacts.
Yeah, good analogy. But the stakes in the real world, they can be much, much higher.
And that brings us to the idea of deterrence, which is a big part of the report.
Deterrence is all about influencing the other side's decisions, making them think twice before escalating.
By making them believe that escalating would cost them more than they'd gain.
Precisely. Now, traditional deterrence often relies on the threat of punishment. If you escalate, we'll hit back harder.
But that doesn't always work, does it? Especially if the other side doesn't believe you'll actually follow through.
Yeah, it's like a bluff that could easily be called.
Especially if they think they have more to gain by escalating than you do.
And that's where the report highlights this idea of denial-based deterrence.
Ah, yeah, that rings a bell. Can you remind me how that works?
So instead of relying on threats, denial-based deterrence is about convincing the other side that their escalation attempts are just going to fail.
It's like building a fortress that's so strong, any attack would be pointless.
Exactly. You're denying them the ability to achieve their goals, even if they escalate.
So it's a more subtle approach, but maybe more effective in certain situations.
Especially where all-out retaliation might be too risky, or where the other side has more at stake and is willing to take bigger risks.
They use the term asymmetry of stakes in the report, right?
Yeah, it basically means the two sides in a conflict, they don't necessarily have the same amount to lose.
Like a small country facing a much larger adversary.
The smaller country, they might be willing to escalate further, even if it seems crazy, because they're fighting for their survival.
So they're looking at the risk-reward calculation completely differently.
And that's why understanding the other side's motivations is so crucial.
It's not just about assessing their military capabilities, it's about understanding their psychology.
What are they afraid of? What are their goals? What are their red lines?
And that leads us to the second type of escalation, inadvertent escalation.
This is where things get really tricky.
Because it's not about intentional provocation, right?
It's about misjudging how your actions will be perceived by the other side.
So one side does something they don't think is a big deal, but the other side sees it as a major escalation.
And boom, you've got a conflict spiraling out of control.
It seems like that could happen pretty easily in today's world, where information spreads so fast and can be so easily manipulated.
Oh, absolutely. And the report talks about how these misunderstandings often come from something they call vague escalation thresholds.
Meaning what, exactly?
What one side sees as a minor move might be a huge red line for the other.
And those lines, they can shift and change during a conflict, can't they?
It's like trying to navigate a minefield where the mines keep moving.
Okay, that's a terrifying thought. So, how do we avoid those kinds of misinterpretations and prevent those inadvertent escalations?
Well, the report really stresses the importance of clear communication. You've got to understand the other side's perspective and make sure you're clearly communicating your own limits.
So, it's not just about threats, it's about having a real dialogue.
Exactly, trying to get everyone on the same page about what actions would cross those critical lines.
So, there's no room for misinterpretation.
Right, and the report uses a historical example, the First Gulf War. Saddam Hussein, he was given a very explicit warning about using chemical weapons.
And they made it clear what the consequences would be if he did.
And whether it was the clarity of that warning or other factors, he didn't use chemical weapons.
So that shows how clear communication can actually prevent a really bad escalation.
It's about what the report calls strategic signaling.
Using communication not just to threaten, but to clarify, reassure, and maybe even de-escalate the situation.
Right. Now, we've talked about deliberate and inadvertent escalation. What about the third type, accidental escalation?
That seems like the toughest one to predict or control.
Yeah, accidents are, by definition, unpredictable. But the report argues that there are things we can do to minimize the risks.
Because in a high-pressure situation like war, even a small mistake could have huge consequences.
Absolutely. And the report talks about the importance of what they call effective force management.
Meaning what, exactly?
It's about having the right training, clear rules of engagement, strong command and control structures, all those things that help prevent mistakes from turning into disasters.
So it's about having multiple layers of checks and balances.
Right. You want a system that can absorb those shocks, those little mistakes, and prevent them from cascading into something much bigger.
It makes me think about the role of technology in all of this, because the report talks about that too, right? How technology is changing the escalation game.
Yeah, it's a really important point. The report makes it clear that technology itself doesn't escalate. It's still people making those decisions.
It's like a weapon is just a tool, right?
Exactly. It's how you use that tool that determines whether it leads to escalation or not.
But technology does change the equation in a lot of ways, doesn't it?
Oh, definitely. It can act as an accelerant, making things escalate much faster and potentially making bad decisions much more costly.
Like having a car that can go from 0 to 100 in a few seconds. It's exciting, but also dangerous.
Exactly. Technology amplifies our decisions, both the good ones and the bad ones.
And the consequences can be huge.
The report talks about how technology is blurring the lines between conventional and nuclear warfare.
Making it harder to establish those clear thresholds we were talking about.
Think about cyber attacks, for example. A sophisticated cyber attack, it could cripple a country's infrastructure, cause massive disruption.
But is that an act of war? Does that justify military response?
Those are tough questions, and technology is making those questions harder to answer.
It seems like we're entering a whole new era of uncertainty when it comes to managing escalation.
That's a good way to put it. And this uncertainty, it's only going to increase as technology keeps evolving.
The report even talks about artificial intelligence and the risks of AI making decisions about the use of force.
It's a scary thought, but we need to start thinking about it now.
Before those technologies become even more powerful and even more widespread.
Exactly. We need to be proactive, not reactive, when it comes to the impact of technology on conflict.
We've covered a lot of ground here, and there's one more concept I'm really interested in digging into: escalation dominance.
Ah, yes. That's a fascinating one.
It's like the idea of having so much power that you can control how a conflict unfolds.
The report explores that idea in detail, and it's not as straightforward as it might seem.
It sounds almost too good to be true.
Well, as we'll explore in part 2, it often is. Attempting to dominate the escalation ladder can backfire in a big way.
I'm definitely intrigued. Looking forward to unpacking that in the next part.
We'll dive into all that, and we'll also look at the report's specific recommendations for the U.S. Air Force.
Sounds good. I can't wait.
So, we were talking about escalation dominance.
Yeah, it's like this idea that you can just, I don't know, outmuscle your opponent at every level.
It sounds pretty tempting, right? Especially if you've got the military might to back it up.
It's almost like you're holding all the cards.
But the report, it kind of throws some cold water on that idea.
Oh, really? How so?
Well, for starters, true escalation dominance, it's really hard to achieve.
I guess it's more complicated than just having the biggest guns.
Exactly. And the report, it points out that trying to, strong-arm your way to the top of the escalation ladder, it can backfire.
Because the other side might just keep escalating in response.
Yeah, even if they're weaker, they might feel like they have no choice but to keep pushing back.
So you end up in this dangerous spiral. Both sides just keep raising the stakes.
Exactly. It's what they call reciprocal escalation.
A game of chicken with, like, potentially global consequences.
Right. And the report, it argues that the cases where one side actually achieved escalation dominance, they were often less about, overwhelming force.
And more about exploiting specific vulnerabilities in the opponent.
Exactly. They call them asymmetric vulnerabilities.
So it's not just about having the strongest military. It's about finding those pressure points that really make the other side uncomfortable.
Precisely. And they even use an interesting example in the report. They talk about the U.S.'s own casualty aversion, the fact that we're generally less willing to accept high casualties than some of our adversaries.
That's an interesting point. Even if you have a more powerful military, if you're facing an enemy that's willing to take way more losses, it creates a whole new set of challenges.
Absolutely. It highlights the psychological dimension of warfare, how perceptions of risk and acceptable losses, they can be just as important as, tanks and bombs.
And this all becomes even more crucial when you're talking about nuclear weapons.
Oh,
right?
absolutely. Trying to play the escalation dominance game with a nuclear-armed adversary, that's incredibly dangerous.
Because any miscalculation could lead to, well,
unthinkable consequences. The report really emphasizes that in a nuclear standoff, the focus should be on clear communication, building confidence, and avoiding anything that could be misconstrued as a step towards escalation.
So, in a way, the rules of the game change completely when you're dealing with nuclear weapons.
You could say that, yeah. It's a whole different level of risk and responsibility. Now, speaking of different levels of risk, the report also delves into the challenges of managing escalation in irregular warfare.
Right, because these conflicts, they're not your typical state versus state scenarios.
No, they're often fought against, shadowy networks, insurgents, terrorist groups.
It's hard to even define who the enemy is sometimes.
Exactly. And the report cautions against relying too heavily on conventional military force in these situations.
Because trying to just, blast your way to victory, it often doesn't work, does it?
No, it rarely does.
Yeah.
In fact, it can often make things worse.
By creating more chaos, alienating the local population, and potentially even fueling further escalation.
Exactly. The report argues that in irregular warfare, you need a different approach.
It's more about winning hearts and minds than just winning battles, right?
Exactly. Military force, it might be necessary sometimes, but it should be used very carefully, strategically, and with a clear focus on protecting civilians and minimizing collateral damage.
Because any civilian casualties, they're just going to be used as propaganda by the insurgents.
Right. It'll undermine support for the government and help the insurgents recruit more fighters. The report, it recommends prioritizing non-military approaches whenever possible.
So things like diplomacy, economic development, building trust with local communities.
It's about addressing the underlying causes of the conflict, making the insurgents seem irrelevant.
And giving people a better alternative.
Precisely. Now, the report gets even more specific. It talks about the unique challenges of managing escalation with global jihadist groups.
Right, because these groups, they're driven by an ideology that, well, it doesn't really fit into traditional deterrence models.
They're not as concerned with, self-preservation as a nation-state might be.
And they often view death in combat as a victory.
So the traditional tools of deterrence, threats of punishment, retaliation, they might not be as effective.
That's a really tough problem. What does the report suggest?
Well, they acknowledge that there's no easy answer, but they recommend a multifaceted strategy, one that focuses on limiting the jihadists' ability to escalate.
While also avoiding actions that might inadvertently fuel that escalation.
It's a delicate balance.
Yeah.
The focus should be on things like intelligence sharing, disrupting financing networks, and countering their propaganda.
So limiting their operational capacity and their ability to influence people.
Exactly. But the report doesn't rule out military force entirely.
Right, because sometimes you have to take direct action.
But they stress that any military action, it should be very targeted, restrained, and with a clear focus on minimizing civilian casualties.
Because any misstep, any action that could be perceived as excessive or indiscriminate, it's just going to play into the jihadists' narrative.
Exactly. It's about playing the long game, being patient, and recognizing that a tactical victory on the battlefield might actually be a strategic setback if it leads to further escalation.
It's a whole different way of thinking about warfare.
It is. Now, shifting gears a bit, let's talk about the role of technology in all of this.
Right, because we touched on it earlier, but the report really digs into how technology is changing the escalation game.
It's kind of a paradox, isn't it? We have all this advanced technology, but somehow managing escalation seems to be getting harder, not easier.
It's like having a car that can go incredibly fast.
But you're not sure if you can control it.
Exactly. The report makes the point that while technology itself doesn't escalate, it can definitely speed things up.
Giving leaders less time to react and potentially increasing the risk of miscalculations.
And it's also blurring the lines between different types of warfare, right?
Yeah, like we talked about with cyber attacks. It can be hard to say whether a cyber attack is an act of war that justifies a conventional military response.
Or even a nuclear response. It's a really gray area.
And those gray areas are only going to get wider as technology continues to evolve.
The report even raises the issue of artificial intelligence and the potential for AI systems to make decisions about the use of force without human oversight.
It's a pretty unsettling thought,
Yeah.
but it's something we need to be thinking about now.
Before those technologies get even more advanced and more widely deployed.
Exactly. We need to be thinking about how to integrate these new technologies into our strategies for managing escalation
And how to develop the safeguards to ensure that we can control those technologies.
before they start controlling us.
This has been a really eye-opening conversation. I'm starting to see the whole issue of escalation in a whole new light.
It's definitely a complex topic, but I think the insights from this RAND report, they can be really valuable.
Not just for people in the military, but for anyone who's involved in decision-making in high-stakes environments.
Absolutely. It's about understanding the dynamics of conflict and developing the skills to navigate those challenges effectively.
In the next part, we'll look at the report's specific recommendations for the U.S. Air Force.
And we'll discuss how those recommendations might apply to other organizations and other situations.
I'm looking forward to it. Okay, so we spent a lot of time talking about the big picture of escalation, the theory, the different types, the challenges. But now I'm kind of curious, what does all this mean for the U.S. Air Force specifically?
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, managing escalation, it's ultimately a strategic and political challenge, right? But the Air Force, well, they play a pretty big role in how all this plays out.
It's interesting because, the Air Force, they're all about speed, precision, global reach, all that.
Right. It's like, they have this incredible capability to strike quickly and decisively, but that also means they can contribute to escalation, maybe even unintentionally.
It's like a scalpel, right? A surgeon can use it to save a life, but it can also do a lot of damage.
Exactly. So the question is, how does the Air Force prepare for this? How do they use their capabilities responsibly in this complex world where escalation is always a risk? Well, luckily the report has some thoughts on that.
Oh, good. So what does the report recommend?
Well, one of the key things they emphasize is this idea of proportionate responses.
Proportionate responses. Okay, what does that mean exactly?
It means having a range of options, right? So you can respond to an enemy's actions in a way that matches the severity of the threat.
So you're not just, like, swinging a hammer at every problem.
Right. You want to have the right tool for the job so you can escalate carefully if you need to, but you can also de-escalate or just maintain the status quo.
It's about having options, flexibility.
Exactly. That might mean developing some new capabilities,
Yeah.
right? Filling in some gaps in the Air Force's arsenal so they can respond effectively to a wider range of threats.
Does the report give any specific examples?
Well, they talk about the need to be able to counter things like, chemical or biological weapons attacks, even if the U.S. doesn't possess those weapons themselves.
Makes sense. You want to be able to deter those kinds of attacks, even if you don't want to use them yourself.
Exactly. And that might mean focusing on really robust defenses like early warning systems, protective gear, those kinds of things. And it also means working with other branches of the military and with policymakers to develop strategies for deterring the use of those weapons in the first place.
So it's a whole of government approach.
Right. It's not just an Air Force problem, it's a national security problem.
Okay, so proportionate responses. That's one key recommendation. What else does the report talk about?
Another really important point they make is that the Air Force need to incorporate these ideas of escalation management into its doctrine and training programs.
So it's not just about having the right weapons, it's about knowing how and when to use them.
Exactly. It's about mindset, right?
Yeah.
Understanding the risks of escalation, being able to anticipate potential problems, and having the judgment to make the right decisions under pressure.
Because in a real-world conflict, things can change so quickly.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. And the report specifically says that Air Force commanders, and their staff, they need to be trained on how to identify those escalation risks during the planning process.
So building those considerations into the planning from the very beginning.
Right. Thinking about, okay, if we take this action, how might the other side react? What are the potential consequences? Are there alternative approaches that might be less risky?
It's almost like a checklist, right? Escalation risks. Check, check, check.
Yeah, something like that. But it's more than just a checklist. It's about developing a deep understanding of how escalation works, how to recognize those warning signs, and how to make decisions that minimize the risk of things spiraling out of control.
Because it's not always obvious, is it? Like, what one side might see as a minor action, the other side might see as a major provocation.
Right. And the report is really clear that this training, it should go beyond just rules of engagement.
Because those are just like the basic do's and don'ts, right?
Exactly. It's about going deeper, understanding the other side's perspective, their likely thresholds for escalation, and how those thresholds might shift and change over time.
It sounds like a pretty significant shift in thinking, honestly. Moving away from a purely military mindset to something that's, I don't know, more strategic, more political.
Yeah, you could say that. And the report, it argues that this shift, it needs to be reflected in everything the Air Force does, from its doctrine to its training programs to the way it educates its officers.
So it's a pretty big cultural change.
It is, yeah. But it's a necessary one if the Air Force wants to be effective in the 21st century. It's not enough to just be the best at fighting wars. You also have to be the best at preventing them.
This has been a really fascinating conversation. I feel like I've learned a lot about escalation and the challenges it poses, especially for organizations like the Air Force.
Me too. It's a complex issue, but I think the Rand report does a great job of breaking it down and offering some really practical recommendations.
And for our listeners, I definitely encourage you to check out the full report if you're interested in learning more.
Yeah, there's a lot of great information in there. It's a valuable resource for anyone who wants to understand how conflict works and how to avoid making things worse.
Well, on that note, I think we've reached the end of our deep dive. Thanks for joining us today.
It was my pleasure.
And thanks to our listeners for tuning in. We'll be back soon with another deep dive into a different topic, but until then, keep exploring, keep learning, and remember, knowledge is power, especially when it comes to managing conflict and preventing escalation.